Utilization and coverage reports. Here I want to talk about the difference between the reservation coverage report and the reservation utilization report. Piper and Clinton, they did this topic on how to pass the AWS Certified Cloud Practitioner exam. Piper and Clinton have a question which tests the reader on this very topic. Which Cost Explorer report shows the amount of money you've saved using reserved instances? Is it daily costs? Is that the report? Is it reservation utilization, reservation coverage, or the monthly EC2 running hours cost and usage? Now the answer is B, reservation utilization. They say that report shows you how much you have saved using reserved instances. The reservation coverage report, that shows you how much you could have potentially saved had you purchased reserved instances. The daily costs and monthly EC2 running hours cost and usage reports don't show you how much you've saved using reserved instances. So the idea is that the only report that shows the amount of money you've saved is the utilization report. The RU, reservation utilization report, tells you the good news. U, smiley face, U for utilization. We also have the reserved instance coverage report. I don't think the description of it is very clear. For example, Piper and Clinton write that it tells you 1. How many of your running instance hours are covered by instance reservations. 2. How much you've spent for on-demand instances. And 3. How much you could have saved by purchasing reserved instances. So the coverage report tells us 3 things. But it's not clear which of the 3 things here is essential, and an item common to all 3 is not immediately clear, or a common theme. It just seems a bit strange. Recall that the utilization report tells you how much you have saved. The U reminded us of a face smiling about savings. The second feature of coverage, which is above, the coverage report, is how much you've spent. But isn't a spent amount just the same as a saved amount? If I tell a housemate I just spent just £5 on a jacket, on a £20 jacket, then I have told them how much I saved. I've put and vice versa, but that's not actually true. I could say I've saved £15, and that doesn't necessarily tell them that I've spent a certain amount, does it? So it's not that bit, ignore that bit, but what is true there is that if I say how much I've spent, I have told someone how much I've saved in certain situations. So we have this ridiculous situation. How can it be that spent amounts distinguish coverage from utilization? Coverage deals with spent amounts and the utilization report deals with saved amounts, seems to be the thought after all. Well, we need to remember that the thing bought is different in each case. Coverage reports concern money spent to purchase on-demand instances. They don't concern money spent per se. And when utilization reports concern saved amounts, it's money saved in opting for reserved instances over on-demand ones. Put it this way, the utilization report gives you some good news, the coverage report gives you some bad news. And the bad news is 2 things. It's how much you've spent and how much you could have saved but didn't. So that's the cold, cruel coverage report. I'm not actually sure what the following means. How many of your running instance hours are covered by instance reservations? What does that even mean? What does it mean for an instance hour to be covered by an instance reservation? Well, presumably you can arrange for your instances to be either on demand or use reservations. And the idea is that these are mutually excluding categories. If you have reserved an instance, then it's not on demand. I presume that for an instance hour to be covered by an instance reservation is for that instance hour to have been reserved. It's not on demand. That's what it means for an instance hour to be covered by a reservation. So the coverage report tells you how many of your instances are covered by reservations. So the report runs. Let's suppose you've piled up a load of reserved instances like a squirrel preparing for a winter. It's now getting into the winter month and you're making your way through your stash that you've built up. You're consuming the stuff you've reserved. Suddenly you think to yourself, oh no, how much have I got left? And the answer to that is found with the reserved instances utilization report. That's quite simple. The utilization report tells you how many of your reserved instances you have used. What we need to remember is that reserved instances are dissimilar in an important way to something like nuts. They are not actual. They are not hidden away somewhere the way nuts are hidden away in the ground. Instead, the reservation just gets used up or fulfilled automatically as soon as you launch an instance that meets its specifications. For example, the platform it runs on is Linux. It's a t2.micro instance. That's what I mean by specifications. This is similar to the way a restaurant does not carry out a specific wooden table when you arrive if you've reserved a table. Instead, reserving a table just means that if you happen to rock up, you're getting one of the tables. The reserved instance coverage report is different. This examines your running instances, the instances that are actually in a running state right now, and it considers how many are covered by reserved instances. So the coverage report deals with concrete things and assesses concrete things. It asks how many of these actual running instances are using up reservations, are fulfilling reservations. This is the equivalent of examining a squirrel's plate and working out how many nuts were located that day, were demanded that day, found that day, and how many are from the reserves. The coverage report might say, whoa, all the nuts you're eating are ones you reserved. In other words, whoa, all your running instances were reserved. Or it might say, none of these were reserved, or half of them were reserved. And note how this is different from the utilization report, which told you how many of your reserved instances you've got through. It's the distinction between 1, a report telling the squirrel how much is left in the reserves, and 2, a report telling the squirrel how much of their meal is from the reserves. The first one is utilization, how much is left in the reserves. Now, is that difficult to remember, the fact that that's the first idea? No, I don't think so. It's about how much you have used, and that's intuitive. I also think it's quite intuitive that we would call the reserved instance, call the second idea, saying how much of what you're getting through now is from the reserves. That's quite intuitive to call that coverage. In what way? Well, the word coverage implies the interaction of two things. You might say a tablecloth covers a table. We could call it the fulfillment report, perhaps. We're looking at how much of your reservations cover your running instances. Perhaps you have complete coverage, all the instances running were reserved, perhaps you only planned a few of them. Okay, so what's the problem with this terminology? The problem really is that people tend to suppose that the utilization report denotes the number of reservations currently being utilized by running instances. And that's really a very reasonable thing to suppose, that the number of reservations currently being utilized by running instances is the idea that gets conveyed by the utilization report. But actually that idea is what the coverage report denotes. Utilization denotes how many reservations have already been used. Anyhow, it would be very odd to talk about a quantity that expressed how many nuts are left in the reserves as coverage. That's true. That doesn't make sense. For instance, what covers what in that situation? So we don't call that idea coverage. How many nuts are left in the reserves? For that, we look to the utilization report. To summarise, what we have provided here is an explanation of the distinction between the reserved instance coverage report and the reserved instance utilization report. Cold coverage reports rub salt in the wound, and utilization gives you good news. How much have you actually saved? Utilization report, by using reserved instances. Now, the textbook by Piper and Clinton shies away from making the distinction between these two things very stark. Confusingly, they say that reserved instance coverage reports do 3 things. 1, tell you how many of your running instance hours are covered by instance reservations. 2, tell you how much you've spent for on-demand instances. And 3, tell you how much you could have saved by purchasing reserved instances. Really though, the second and third idea, how much you've spent on on-demand and how much you could have saved, those two ideas are sort of derived from the first idea. How many of what you're running, the concrete instances you have, are covered. Now, what does the utilization report do in regard to those three ideas? Well, let's consider the first idea. What proportion of the concrete things running are covered? Well, the utilization report tells you the percentage of reserved instances you've used. And that's kind of a related idea, because of course if you know how many reserved instances you have and you know how many of that stock, that reserve you've got through, then you can infer how many reservations are part of the current set of running instances. How many of you, if you also know how many running instances you've got. Okay. What about that second idea? How much you've spent on on-demand? Because that's another thing that the coverage report tells you. How much you've spent on on-demand, like a fool. Well, for that, instead of telling you how much you've spent on on-demand, the utilization report tells you how much you've spent on reserved instances. It does. It calls that the effective reservation cost. The effective reservation cost. So there's a kind of mirroring between the two reports. One tells you how much you've spent on reserved instances, one tells you how much you've spent on demand. Now, as for the third idea, which we get in the coverage report, how much you could have saved by purchasing reserved instances, or you might say by purchasing more reserved instances, well, is there any kind of equivalent to that in the utilization report? Well, there's no could have that is talked of, actually. You are using reserved instances. Indeed, this report tells you how much you did save. It's called total net savings. Sadly, it's not all neat, with one item to match for 1 to 3. Because there's a fourth item in the utilization report. So it has effective reservation cost that it tells you about. It tells you the total net savings, and then also total potential savings. So we have total net savings and total potential savings, which is in the utilization report. Now, presumably this will be a serious amount. If you didn't really reserve enough instances, you're going to have a big total potential savings, because you could have really gone for it and made more reservations, given how much you're actually running in terms of instances. Okay, so you could therefore have saved money if you reserved more than you did. So the could have is perhaps there after all. In the coverage report, it's saying how much you could have saved by having more, by purchasing reserved instances, and total potential savings is also found in the utilization report, which is a comparison between how much you spent on reserved instances and how many instances you actually have running. I think of the utilization report with its total net savings, total potential savings, and of course the effective reservation cost, or ERC. I think of the utilization report as inward facing, looking at how much is left in your stash of reservations. The coverage report is perhaps outward facing, looking at how many running instances are using your reservations. We now need to talk about a third kind of report, cost and usage reports. Cost and usage reports. And when we begin the discussion of Cost Explorer at the end of chapter 6 in this textbook by Piper and Clinton, these are the first things we talk about, cost and usage reports. And they're quite simple. They tell you how much you've spent daily as well as monthly. They present this information graphically. Okay. And then question 23, there's a little end of chapter test. Tests our knowledge of reports. It says, which Cost Explorer report shows the amount of money you've saved using reserved instances? Is it daily costs? That's the name of a report. The reservation utilization report, the reservation coverage report, or the monthly EC2 running hours cost and usage report. And the correct answer is B. How much have you saved using reserved instances? Remember, utilization gives the good news. It's a U for a smiling face. How much you've saved. And this brings out an aspect of utilization reports which we've not yet considered. We described reservation utilization as reports that show you the percentage of your reserved instances that you've used. And that is correct. They tell you, the squirrel, how much is left in the reserved. However, they also do a second, more affirming thing. They show you how much money you've saved by using reserved instances. So in one sense, the utilization reports tell you something positive and something negative. The positive thing is how much you've saved by using reserved instances, and the bad thing is how many reserved instances you've used up. What's potentially more interesting is question 21. This asks us, which of the following report types, Cost Explorer report types, can show you the monthly costs for your reserved instances? Reserved instance recommendations, the reservation coverage report, the reserved instance utilization report, or the cost and usage reports. Now, okay, so which tells you the costs for your reserved EC2 instances? Now the third option, utilization reports, looks very tempting here. Coverage reports remind you how much cash you've devoted to on-demand instances. Do we remember that? Because we said they both coverage reports and utilization reports tell you your costs, but they tell you different costs, right? So coverage reports tell you how much you've spent on on-demand instances, and utilization reports do the same for reserved instances, right? Remember, they tell you the effective reservation cost. Utilization reports tell you how much you've spent on reserved instances, but actually the answer is D, cost and usage reports. And the explanation is that the cost and usage reports show you your monthly spend by service. The reserved instances reports and reserved instance recommendations don't show actual monthly costs. And that's really interesting because both the utilization and coverage reports were described as informing you of how much you've spent. So perhaps the cost really is only effective in effective reservation costs. So it's doing a lot of work, that word effective there. And in fairness, the textbook says that the utilization report tells you how much money you've saved or overspent by using reserved instances. Okay, so it tells you what you've saved or overspent. It's a relative notion, it's overspent. It doesn't tell you what you've spent. And so that was a few clarifications about these two types of report.